Okay, so welcome back to the series of online lectures for HUP 104. We're going to have to take a brief detour through some material on freedom of the will because we're about to enter a section in the course where we'll be dealing with questions about freedom, and we're going to need this under our belt. So this may seem like a bit of a digression, but it actually turns out that it's not. It's quite necessary. Okay, so generally speaking, then, when philosophers talk about freedom of the will, this is a fairly modern thing that really comes into focus philosophically after the rise of Christianity. So, say, for instance, in ancient times, freedom was simply a political notion. You were free if no one owned you, if you didn't have a master. Or in other words, if you weren't a slave, if you were a free person. But later on, freedom came to signify something unique and special that human beings could do, namely choose to do or not to do something. So one common way of getting at the metaphysical idea of freedom is to talk about whether you could have done something different than what you actually did. Or, as the slide here says, whether you could have done otherwise. So, for example, I had coffee this morning, right? So, I'm recording this in the afternoon. This morning when I woke up, I made myself a cup of coffee, but it seems to me that I could have had tea instead of coffee. I have tea in the cupboard. I enjoy iced tea and I enjoy hot tea. And it seems to me that I could have got up this morning and instead of making myself coffee, I could have made myself tea. I didn't make myself tea. So what's actually been done is already set. There's no question about what I actually did. This is a question about whether it was possible at that, given exactly the way things were this morning, if it was possible that I could have done something different. Now, to say that we are free, then, is to say that it's up to us, in some sense, which option we choose. So, if you think about a piece of jargon that's going to become in talking about this, think about something that philosophers call a possible world. So, a possible world is just a convenient way of talking about the ways that the actual world could have been. So, there's a possible world where I did have tea this morning. That was what I was thinking about, it seems, commonsensically, when I said that it was true I could have had tea instead of coffee. What I described was some scenario, some coherent situation where it was true that I did have tea as opposed to having coffee. So that's what we call a possible world. That doesn't mean that this possible world exists anywhere, it doesn't mean that it's a real thing. It's just a coherent way of describing how the actual world could have been as opposed to the way it actually is. So when you tell a story, for instance, you're talking about possible worlds. And it's convenient to think that, or just to, as a formal method, to talk about them, it helps us clarify certain questions. So we're going to say in this terminology that there's a possible world where I could have had tea. There's a possible world where I didn't have anything at all. There's a possible world where I dyed my hair blue instead of having coffee. There's a possible world where I shaved my head. Right? Anything that's possible, there'll be some possible world, by which we just mean a complete description of the way the world could have been. Now, there aren't going to be any possible worlds where there are square circles, you might think, and we could debate that, but we'll, for here, just stipulate that there are no possible worlds that contain contradictions, and that contradiction is really the only limit on what counts as a possible world. If it contains something contradictory, then that's not a possible world. Okay, so using this terminology then of possible worlds, we can start to talk about the different views with respect to freedom of the will. So the first view is determinism. Determinists deny that there is any sense in which you could have done otherwise. Whatever you actually do is what you had to do in a sense of that word had. So the basic idea that the determinist has is that free will is an illusion. Nobody has free will. Now, why do they think this? Well, the usual argument takes its starting point from science. So we know, or at least science seems to have shown us, that the world is a completely causally closed system, a causally closed system, where that means that if you knew the complete state of the world at one given time and all of the laws of physics, you could then predict exactly how the world would evolve over that course of time. And this is something that we do in your average physics class on a very small scale. So if you want to know how fast an object will fall, or if you say how much force you have to apply to get it to move a certain distance, we can calculate those with great accuracy. And that's, of course, the way that we guide missiles and the way that we calculate the trajectory of cannonballs and bullets through the air and so on. All of that wonderful stuff that CSI shows like CSI and Law and Order are based on, our knowledge of the causal laws of the universe and being able to use those laws to predict, or even to retrodict, which means to predict backwards in time, what happened at a previous distance in time behind us. And that's what you're doing at a murder scene, basically. So the determinist then is someone who thinks that, well, if you had complete knowledge of physics, like we only have a limited knowledge and we can predict a lot of stuff, but if you had complete knowledge of physics, you'd be able to predict any future state given the state that the universe is in now. And given that human behavior is caused by the brain, and the brain is a completely physical system, determinists therefore conclude that all of our actions are determined by the brain. So the brain is a physical object, it's subject to the laws of physics, and therefore its behavior is determined by the laws of physics. And so the way that this manifests itself is at the level of psychology of mental states. So for instance, the determinist says which actions a person performs is going to be the causal result of the total sum of the beliefs and desires, wishes, phobias, fears, etc., of a person's mental life. So to take a simplified version, if you believe that there is beer in the refrigerator and you have a strong desire for a beer and nothing that overrules that desire, then those things together will cause you to get up and walk to the refrigerator, open the door, and get the beer. So whatever is the strongest causal force in a person's psychological milieu, or whatever the economy of a person's psychology, that's going to result in a person behaving in a certain way. Now, determinism is the view that we have no free will, that our actions are caused by some previous state, which is caused by some previous state, etc. And oftentimes people who are new to this think that determinism is the same as a view known as fatalism. Well, let's distinguish fatalism here and make sure that we don't fall into this trap. So fatalism is the view, which is that no matter what it is that you do, you can't change what your destiny is. So this is the view commonly expressed by the student. Says, look, whether I study or not, if I'm going to pass, I'm going to pass. So I either pass or I don't. Whether I study doesn't affect it. If I'm supposed to pass, then I'll pass. I'm just wasting my time studying because whatever is going to happen is going to happen. So that's the view expressed by fatalism. Or for instance, a student might say, look, whether I go to med school or not, I'm going to be a doctor. That's what I was meant to be, right? No matter what happens to me, I'm going to be a doctor. Now, the basic idea here is that the choices one makes don't matter. So fatalism is often portrayed in movies. So for instance, here's a popular portrayal of fatalism in a movie called Sliding Doors with Gwyneth Paltrow. So it's a movie of basically showing you two possible worlds. sort of simultaneously. One where she is coming home from work and she gets on the subway as normal and she goes home. The other one where she just misses that train and so has to wait for the next train. And then the story diverges at that point. You see in both parallel universes or possible worlds, you see what's going on. So in the possible world where she catches the train, she catches her boyfriend cheating on her. He's in there with someone else while she's at work. She comes home early. She catches him. They break up. She's sad. She meets a guy she really likes. They live happily ever after, and she's better off for it. Okay, so in the other possible world where she doesn't catch the train, she doesn't catch her boyfriend cheating on her because she doesn't come home at that time. She comes home at a different time in that possible world, a later time. And the guy has already finished and the woman has left. So she doesn't know that he's cheating. But lo and behold, things work out in such a way that they break up for different reasons, and she meets the very same guy, the guy that she met in the other possible world, and they instantly fall in love and hit it off and live happily ever after. So no matter what, it seems like you could draw this inference from the plot. No matter what she does, she's going to meet this guy and be happy. And that's the basic idea behind fatalism. It's the idea that you don't really have any control over what's going to happen. That's part of it. But it's also that you could struggle and it's going to happen anyway. Even if you did this thing, it's going to happen. Even if you don't do that thing, it's going to happen. No matter what you do in any possible situation, there's only one end. Now that's different than determinism. Determinism is the claim that at each moment your choices are determined by psychological factors, ultimately by physical factors reducible to the laws of physics and the way that material objects behave. But it's not the claim that no matter what you do, you get the same result. Because, for instance, the determinist claims if you don't study, you probably won't pass. Now, whether you study or not isn't up to you in some sense. It's determined by your psychology or by the laws of physics or something like that. But it's not the case that if you study or don't study, you're going to pass. It's only the case that whichever you do is sort of out of your control. Now, so therefore your choices do matter according to the determinist. It's just that you aren't in control of your choices. Okay, so finally then, one very popular view that philosophers have held is something called compatibilism. So compatibilists hold that free will and determinism are, well, you probably guessed it from the name, compatible. So their claim is that when we properly understand what it means for our actions to be free, we see that a free action is just doing what one wants to do. So in common sense terms, if someone forces you to do something, we say it wasn't done freely. And when no one forces you, we say that it was done freely. So they claim to be free is for you to be the cause of your actions. So a famous compatibilist philosopher offers these kinds of illustrations. Suppose that you are lost in the desert and you want to eat food. You would eat food if you could. It's just that you have no food. You're out there in the desert. There's no food around. So in that case, it seems like you're doing something. You're not eating. You're fasting. But your fasting isn't freely done by you because if there was food around, you would eat it. You want to eat the food. Now consider another case, the case of a person like Gandhi who has food around but doesn't want to eat it. He refrains from eating it. He refrains from eating it because he wants to fast. He's making a point or something like that. So in one case we say this action is free, the fasting. That's the Gandhi case because he wanted to do it. In the other case we say no, some external cause is the source. So the compatibilist claims that, well, both of the intuitions are true here. We have freedom of the will. We can do what we want. That's what it means to be free. But our beliefs and desires, our wants and so on, cause our behavior, so our actions are determined. Ultimately, we don't have control over which beliefs and desires and so on we have, but we do have free will in the only sense that it makes sense to claim, the compatibilist argues, namely, we can do what we want. So, how is it that we're free again, you might be wondering to yourself? Well, the compatibilist argues that a free action is one that is caused by the agent's desires and beliefs. So again, to use my example, if I want a beer and believe that there was beer in the refrigerator, these mental states will cause me to go and get a beer. Now, even though my actions are caused, they say, there is a sense in which I could have done otherwise, and this is important for the compatibilist because they want to argue that compatibilism captures the common sense notion of what it means to be free. So often famous compatibilists will say things like, well, gee, this whole free will debate is really just a figment of our definitions. And once we sort of realize what we actually mean when we say that our actions are free or that they aren't free, we'll have realized that there is no dispute between the claim that all actions are caused, all behavior is caused, and that we are free. So they say, look, I could have done otherwise this morning, or when I will go get the beer, because if I had wanted juice instead of beer, then I would have got juice. If I had believed that the beer was in the cupboard, I would have went there instead of the refrigerator. Now, of course, for this to happen, we would have to require a sort of different causal history of the universe, maybe all the way back to the Big Bang, since everything, one cause leading to the next cause leading to the next cause, is pretty well mapped out. But or you might think, well, there are these branching worlds and there are probabilities of this happening or that happening, so it depends on had things been slightly different, gone causally different, then you would have at that point wanted tea in that morning, and then you would have got tea. So there is a sense in which you could have done otherwise, says the compatibilist. So their view is, look, hey, there's no big deal here. Now finally, this brings us to the libertarian. Libertarians hold that free actions are completely uncaused. So they say they're not caused at all by anything, they're merely produced by an act of the will. So when one acts freely, there's a faculty that one has called the will, which initiates the action and which has no cause which came before it. It's a completely uncaused kind of thing. But that doesn't mean that it's random. To say that it has nothing that causes it is not to say that it's random, claims the libertarian. It's to say that it was not produced by anything that came before it. It's a spontaneous act of the will. So their view is that you have these choices in front of you and you deliberate as between which of the choices you'll take, and then you choose one of the choices instead of the other one, and that you could have chosen the other one, not if you had wanted to, but even wanting everything in exactly the same way. In other words, being in exactly all the same mental states, you could have gone one way or the other, because all the mental states you have, none of them act as causes. Now, of course, they claim that one's desires are reasons to act in a certain way. So they give you a reason to act in a way, but they don't cause you to act in a certain way. So that's the difference. The determinist thinks that, well, your desires and your beliefs taken together produce a certain action as a causal result, whereas the libertarian thinks, no, you can have all that, and then you still have to decide which way to act. They don't cause you to act in any one way or another way. It's still up to you to decide to act that way or another way. So you may want to get the beer, you may believe that it's in there, but unless there's this other thing, a free act of the will, which then initiates the action of going and getting the beer, then there will be no beer getting behavior. So you can have the exact same desires and yet not the same kind of action. Now, why is this all important for our purposes is because of the issue of moral responsibility. So the straightforward determinist denies that there's any such thing as moral responsibility because they think that everything is determined. So here's an analogy that famous determinists have used. For instance, Friedrich Nietzsche uses this analogy. Suppose there's a hurricane blowing around some town, destroying houses, killing people, destroying property. We say that's a terrible thing to have happened, but nobody thinks that the hurricane is a morally bad being. Well, why is that? Well, because the hurricane is just a physical system. The winds are just governed by the laws of physics. The particles are moving around. They have no control. They're not doing anything on purpose. They're just sort of being swept around by the laws of physics. It happens to swing that way. It happens to swing the other way. That house gets destroyed. This person gets killed. So you don't blame the hurricane because it doesn't have any control over its behavior. And the same is true of the wild animal. If a wild animal attacks a small child, we don't say that the animal is evil. Sure, we destroy it, we put it down, but we don't say that what it did was morally bad for the animal to have done that. Of course, it's just a mechanism. It has no free will. It has instincts and so on. It acts according to the way it was sort of built to act, whether you believe it was built by a higher power or by evolution. It's sort of got a set of instructions built into it either way, and it's acting out that program. So when it attacks a small child, it's just doing what a wild animal does. It has no control over its behavior in a real sense. It's just purely determinism. So the determinist says, well, if that's true of us too, but just on a more sophisticated level, we think we have free will when we really don't. We think we're in control of our actions when really we're just like the lion or we're just like the hurricane. Well, then there's no sense in which you can blame me for my moral faults then, because I don't have any control over them. I couldn't have done anything differently. So why are you blaming me? Now, of course, you also can't praise a person who acts morally. You can't say that they deserve to be praised because no one deserves anything if the determinist is right. We are all just acting in the way that we must. Now, libertarians, of course, claim that that's wrong. We do have free will. We are morally responsible for our actions. And in fact, they claim that unless you can really make sense of the fact that someone could have done something differently, you can't morally blame them for what they do. So they agree with the determinist about that. But then they go on to say, oh, but we could have done something differently. We can make sense of this idea that we could have done something other than what we did, and that's why we're responsible. So, for instance, the rapist, even though they may be attracted to the person, even though they may, whatever else is going on with them, they have free will, they can refrain from doing what they're doing, and the fact that they don't refrain from doing what they're doing is the reason we blame them. So the libertarian says, look, no form of determinism can really make sense of moral responsibility, why it is that we hold some people morally responsible for their actions. Now, interestingly, the compatibilist thinks that you can get a sense of moral responsibility from compatibilism. And in fact, they say that, look, unless you're the cause of your own actions, right, unless you're the source of them, what sense does it make to claim that you're responsible for your actions? So let's briefly take a look at this because this is going to play a role in what we're going to talk about later. So a philosopher, Harry Frankfurt, who's at Harvard, currently still alive, famously introduced a thought experiment to try to show that the idea that we need to be able to do something other than what we actually do in order to be morally responsible for our actions is misguided. So consider this fictional person named Bill. Now, suppose that Bill wants to kill his friend Jill for whatever reason. Suppose that he's been plotting to kill Jill for a very long time. Now, enter John. John doesn't really think that Bill has what it takes to go through with killing Jill, but he really wants to see Jill dead. So what John does is he arranges a special brain implant, which he can put into Bill's brain. And what it does is it detects Bill's choosing. So suppose that we're able to tell the part of the brain which is the forerunner of the choice, and so it can tell from monitoring the brain activity whether Bill's going to choose to kill Jill or not. Okay, so now the device is put into the brain unbeknownst to Bill, like he's asleep and drugged, and then he wakes up, he doesn't even realize it happened. And what the device ultimately does is, if Bill decides to kill Jill as he planned, he wants to kill her, he's planned it. If he follows through with it on his own, then the device does nothing. However, if Bill gets cold feet and he decides not to kill Jill, then the device stimulates his brain. It kicks in and stimulates his brain in such a way as that he goes ahead and kills her. So it causes him to kill her. Now, what we then have, so he's got this device in his brain. Now we imagine that Bill does in fact go ahead with his plan and kill Jill. The device never kicks in. It's there, but it never kicks in. He wanted to kill Jill. He planned on killing Jill. He did kill Jill. So the device played no role in this. Now, it seems as though Bill acted freely in this case. He wanted to do it, and he did it. And it also seems that he is morally responsible for his actions. If you ask people about this, I don't know what you feel, but I certainly have the intuition that, yeah, we should blame him for it. He's responsible for that. But, well, Bill is supposed to be in the situation as the compatibilist sees it. So he couldn't have done anything other than what he did, right? The situation is set up so that if he chooses to do otherwise, he's forced neurally to go through the action. So there's no sense in which he could have done something differently. However, we still think he's morally responsible. So compatibilists have seized on these kinds of examples and argued that they show that you don't need the libertarian understanding of freedom in order to get moral responsibility, since we judge that Bill is morally responsible even though he couldn't have done something differently. And being able to do something differently is the very heart of what the libertarians claim to be free will and the ground of moral responsibility.